are in listen-only mode.
Hello everyone. Thank you for joining us for the second session in the 2017 series of Getting to Zero webinars. Today's session is Planning for Districts and Urban Environments. I'm Ralph Denola, CEO of New Buildings Institute. Before we begin, I have a couple of housekeeping things to tell you about. First, you are muted and we cannot hear you. This helps to keep the background noise down so that everyone can better hear the speakers. I want to direct you to the dashboard that you should be able to see on the right-hand side of your screen. If you're having technical difficulties and cannot see the slides or hear our speakers, you can use the question pane in the dashboard to let us know so that we can help you. We will take questions at the end of the webinar, but you can ask questions anytime during the session in that same question pane. If you need a certificate of attendance, you will be able to find that in the tab in the dashboard. At the end of the webinar, you'll be given an opportunity to take a short survey. Those seeking AIA credits, you can enter your number in the survey where it's asked, and we really encourage you to provide feedback through that survey. This webinar will also be available as a recorded session at the end of the webinar. I also want to take a moment to thank our sponsors. Their generous support makes this webinar series possible. Thank you to all the sponsors, and you can see them listed here. Okay, so I'm Ralph Denola. I'm CEO at New Buildings Institute. I want to just introduce you to NBI. NBI is a nonprofit based in Portland, Oregon. We've been operating, this is our 20th year. And our efforts are focused on advancing commercial building energy efficiency, and we do that through our approach, which we call we do that through having a vision for what's needed in the commercial building sector, and through our thought leadership, we advance research. We develop solutions for practitioners, and we then move that into the development of advanced codes and policy. So let me introduce our panel today, starting with Charles Ely. Charles is an architect, mechanical engineer, and author with 40 years experience in energy efficient and sustainable design. During his career, Mr. Ely has made significant contributions to California energy standards, ASHRAE 90.1, and energy codes in Hong Kong, Hawaii, Guam, American Samoa, and Australia. Mr. Ely worked as lead consultant to the California Energy Commission to update the state energy efficiency standards for 5 code update cycles, and Charles is also a senior fellow here at New Buildings Institute. Next, I want to introduce Eric Schafran. Eric is the founder and principal at SII and is currently serving as Portfolio Integration Manager for the City and County of Denver on the redevelopment of the National Western Center, which he will be sharing today. Prior to founding SII, Eric worked as director of Romani Group, Inc., Icon Venture Group, and owner's representative firm specializing in major league sports and cultural construction projects. He also spent 4 years in the equities division at Goldman Sachs, where he worked as a financial analyst specializing in the real estate sector. And then finally, our moderator for the session today is Ken Sandler. Ken is a Sustainability and Green Building Advisor for the General Services Administration, Office of Federal High Performance Green Buildings, and he manages research, identifies best practices, and coordinates outreach to green building in the federal building portfolio. He directed energy efficiency research with the Army to help Fort Carson, Colorado achieve its net zero energy goal, as well as research on green roof benefits and challenges. He manages GSA's Green Building Advisory Committee, which developed the advice letter recommendations for adoption of net zero energy buildings by all federal agencies, and serves as co-chair of the Interagency Sustainability Working Group. So I wanted to just start with a little context. Many of you are probably aware that NBI has been maintaining a tracking database of Zini buildings nationally. And we've been doing this for several years now, and you can see evidence of growth in the documentation of Z&E verified buildings in districts, emerging buildings, and what we call ultra low energy buildings. So you can see over the past several years we've seen doubling of the number of buildings, and since we released our list in October, we're now up to a total of 430 buildings that we have tracked towards getting to zero. Other evidence that's really important for us to note, we see that the buildings that are verified as zero net energy show a roughly 75% reduction in energy consumption compared to the CBEX data from the 2012 survey. So we see that energy efficiency before renewables is an important first step to getting to zero. Tracking the Z&E buildings across North America and in the United States, we see that there's evidence of buildings in every climate zone. We are tracking 45 states and provinces in North America that have Z&E buildings. And we also recognize that the public sector adoption of Z&E is really significant, but we also note that there's been growth in the private sector, and 30% of the buildings we're tracking are private for-profit developments. And also that the education sector is really significant. So 38% of the buildings that we're tracking are in the education sector. You can also see that office and multifamily are significant as well. And when we think about scaling Z&E and the session that we're talking about today, planning for districts and urban environments, you know, we see that districts are a key component of scaling Z&E. So we've been looking at different scaling frameworks like prototypes, portfolios, and districts, and we see that this is a key element of scaling Z&E. And we also recognize in the work that we're doing that codes and policy are really heading on a pathway to zero. So whether it's in Oregon, California, Vancouver, British Columbia, Washington, or New York, that there is a defined pathway to zero. And so I think our panelists will cover that as well. You can have access to resources related to Z&E at newbuildings.org. So we have an entire hub of information that you can leverage. Plus, there's many different resources we can point to. The 2 books of case studies that are put out by Pacific Gas and Electric. We have also case studies developed by NBI for the California Public Utilities Commission, and of course our database and registry. And we can also have you added to our Z&E Action Bulletin, an annual publication of news items that you can look forward to catching up on. So we would be happy to support your efforts and empower your team to get to zero through trainings, planning tools, tours, workshops, and other supportive services. And so with that, I'm going to hand the presentation over to Ken Sandler of GSA and look forward to a great panel. Go ahead, Ken.
Thanks, Ralph. Hopefully everyone can hear me well. So as Ralph said, I work for the U.S. government's Landlords General Services Administration, cool little team called the Office of Federal High Performance Green Buildings. We were created to coordinate high performance green building activity across the federal government, where there has been a lot going on over, gosh, the last decade and a little longer than that. I want to start by discussing what the federal government has been doing on both net zero energy buildings and campuses, and then provide a little broader perspective on net zero campuses in particular before turning it over to my fellow speakers to talk more on that. So for a little perspective, GSA has about 10,000 assets, about 380 million square feet. The whole federal government has about 3.3 billion square feet, representing over 485,000 buildings. Most of that is Department of Defense. They're, in terms of the 80-20 world, they're the 80. So moving to the next slide, in terms of some of the drivers of green building at the federal level, we have the Energy Independence and Security Act of 2006, 7 actually has a net zero fossil fuel requirement by new buildings, all new buildings by 2030. There's sort of a scale down year by year before then, as well as some energy use reduction, EUI reduction goals. Executive orders, we have had a whole series of greening the government executive orders, really dating back to the first Bush administration. And so the latest one, 13693, from the Obama administration, had really detailed requirements. Every agency had to submit a sustainability plan, a lot of details, requirements, energy, water, etc., including on net zero. In addition to the new building requirement, there was a requirement that every agency set its own goal for existing net zero energy, net zero water, and or net zero waste buildings. So GSA's goal, we call 25 by 25, basically 25 net zero energy, water, or waste buildings by 2025. We already, by the way, have 2 net zero energy buildings, the Wayne Aspinall Courthouse in Colorado and the Elmira Christian building in St. Croix. In terms of particular programs, one of the most important pushing us towards net zero in existing buildings is our Deep Energy Retrofit program with the Rocky Mountain Institute. We use energy savings performance contracts and have really pushed them beyond the typical 10 to 20% savings. Our first round, we got 38% energy savings on average. So it's really a strong tool for us and not using the taxpayer money thanks to the ESPCs. A couple other programs worth mentioning, REOPT with the National Renewable Energy Lab, NREL, did a whole assessment of our portfolio looking for the best opportunities to deploy renewables. So we're proceeding with that. Also, in terms of energy storage, put out a request for information on opportunities there. If you want to move to the next slide. We basically really quickly summarizing what we've learned from net zero. I kind of came up with these 3 Ps, you know, because I think the barrier is not technological. There's certainly, particularly in terms of energy efficiency, there's so much available technology. Key really is policy. I mean, you could see the agencies that have really moved ahead, and now really the whole federal government in many ways, with the clear policy, you know, towards green building and with net zero as a component. That way it gets incorporated in budgets, contracts, performance standards, training programs, and that's how you really get things done, by being in all those different processes in the federal government. Planning, things take a long time to plan in the federal government, so getting in as early as possible, getting integrated, you know, having planners, designers, contractors, users, budget, procurement, etc., all involved at the earliest stage. And then the people side, just the behavioral change component for both occupants and facility managers. We can move to the next slide. So whereas, you know, most of our progress, I mean, the federal government was one of the earliest leaders on the LEED program, for example. So we've been working on high-performance green buildings for a long time. And we're now making that shift bit by bit to campuses. Here's a picture of the National Renewable Energy Lab, and they have made great progress. They have a couple net zero buildings. They have a lot of PV, as you can see here. And DOE's Federal Energy Management Program now has a campus team, as actually the majority of federal buildings are on campuses. Again, DOD being the big dog in the room. And speaking of which, on the next slide is basically from the Army about their net zero initiative, which has been an incredible program starting in 2010. Again, the focus of net zero energy, net zero water, and net zero waste, where they've had these 17 pilot installations, most of them taking one of those goals, energy, water, or waste. There's only 2 bases that are pursuing both. That's Fort Carson and Fort Bliss. But you you know, it's actually grounded in security considerations, energy security, water security, very serious concerns about terrorism or hacking or what have you, disrupting energy and water supplies. And, you know, this is the Army's response, and they have a good case to make it. So they've really been the leader in this net zero campus approach. So we move to the next slide. Getting beyond the federal perspective, I just wanted to give a little sort of broad picture on net zero at the campus level to introduce what my fellow speakers are going to be talking about next. So advantages of doing net zero at the campus level. Obviously, we're trying to influence these massive resource flows of the, you know, locally, regionally, nationally, globally. And so the larger scale you're at, the more influence you have beyond the building to a campus. Certainly campuses, you can take more advantage of the ecology of the site, and, you know, where you site the PV, the wind, other renewables clearly makes a difference in their efficiency. And of course, you have more space for these devices as well. On the campus level, you have the opportunity to employ broad energy savings approaches, you know, district energy, combined heat and power, you know, time the building automation campus-wide. And you have financial as well. You have economies of scale, bundling, you know, ESPCs, for example, and leveraging bargaining power. So working with utilities, governments, you know, you're a bigger voice with the whole campus to offer. So moving to the next slide. In terms of some of the challenges as well. I mean, obviously, when you're working at a bigger scale, you're a bigger target. Politically, you know, it's easier to go against you, knock you down. And of course, you know, planning responsibilities on the campus level are certainly greater. Financial and legal hurdles. For example, you know, in some states, if you're seriously generating energy at a certain scale, you know, you're legally considered a utility. I know Rocky Mountain Institute has one project in Pittsburgh, the Almona project, where they are, it's a large development, and they actually took on the challenge of being a integrated energy service provider, providing all different energy services, you know, basically like a little utility for the site. So it's an interesting model. More players, more training needed, and really, you know, making that leap from a building is just can be considered an experiment to really doing all this work at scale. So next slide, that's basically it for me, and just wanted to introduce these topics and then hand it over to my fellow speakers to really delve in more detail.
All right, Charles, you want to go ahead and take it away?
Okay, well, thank you, Ralph. Next slide, please. Next. I want to start with by just defining zero energy buildings. The U.S. Department of Energy published this report in late 2015. Next. And essentially, according to this definition, which is one I subscribe to, a building is zero energy when all of the delivered energy to the building, building electricity, gas, chilled water, steam, anything that's delivered across the property line, when that is less than or equal to the exported energy, then the building is a zero net energy building. One thing kind of interesting to note is that they specifically address electric vehicle charging, and if you have EV charging stations on the site and the vehicles are being charged and they're driven off-site, that's considered exported energy. So so it doesn't count against you in trying to achieve Z&E. Next slide. Next. So the concept of Z&E can be, the boundary can be broadened to include a campus. A campus is a group of buildings that are on a contiguous site, and instead of looking at the energy accounting for individual buildings, you look at energy accounting for the entire campus. I did some teaching at Foothill College just south of San Francisco a couple of years ago, and they have a 2 megawatt PV system over the student parking that serves all the buildings on campus, and individual buildings don't have their renewable energy systems or solar collectors. They have one large system for the whole campus. So the Z&E test is the same, except the boundary is broadened. Next slide. The Z&E test can also be applied to communities, and these don't have to be contiguous. A community could be a homeowners association or a business. There's various ways, and you can have one large source of renewable energy that supplies multiple buildings within this community. But again, the test is that the delivered energy to the community should be less than or equal to the energy exported from the community. Next slide, please. And then the final concept I want to talk about is a portfolio. With a portfolio, could be a school district, it could be a business that's managing multiple offices. And this, again, is a virtual Z&E boundary. The buildings don't have to be contiguous. And you look at the total energy delivered to this portfolio and compare it to the total energy exported from the portfolio and apply the Z&E test in this way. Next slide. School districts, as I mentioned, are a good example of this. These are the schools located within the Dry Creek Elementary School District, just east of Sacramento. Some of these sites have the potential for a lot of renewable energy. Some sites have less potential. So when you group them all together, it makes the job of achieving Z&E at the portfolio level much easier. Next slide. I want to talk about some challenging building types, and the concept I'm going to be using here is what I call the collector area to floor area ratio. So if you needed a ratio of 0.33 to achieve Z&E, you'd need to have PVs on 1/3 of the roof of a 1-story building, 2/3 of a 2-story, and the entire roof of a 3-story building. Next slide. If it's 50%, then it's obviously more PV per square foot of floor area. Next slide. And when you get to a ratio of 1, then it's challenging for sure. Next slide. So what I did is I looked at some typical building types and some typical climates. The climates are shown across the top and building types on the left side. And the numbers in this table represent the collector to floor area ratio that's needed to achieve Z&E. And this is when the building itself is designed to maximum technical potential in terms of its energy efficiency. So all of these buildings would be in the ultra-low energy efficient, ultra-low energy use category that Ralph Danola was talking about earlier in the NBI list. Next. So the yellow line here, everything above the yellow line, Z&E would be feasible for one-story buildings. Below the yellow line, you would need PV in the parking area or in other areas in the side. Next. And this is the delineation for two-story buildings. If above the line, Z&E would be feasible for two-story buildings. Next. And finally, for 4 or more story buildings. So you can see that schools, retail, offices, warehouses present many fewer challenges, and the biggest challenges are for the energy-intensive buildings like restaurants for sure, healthcare, hotels, but also supermarkets, which aren't shown here, are also very energy-intensive and would present some challenges. Next slide. Next. So tall buildings are clearly a challenge, and there are some off-site options. Stanford University is a good example. They have upgraded their central plant to be all electric, and it produces chilled water and hot water for all of the campus buildings. Rather than put solar collectors on the mission-style architecture that's characteristic of the campus, Stanford chose to build a 73-megawatt system in the California desert. So they're pumping electricity into the grid in one place and taking it out in Palo Alto. So this is an example of a wholly owned off-site renewable energy system. Next slide. Next. You know, Stanford is a special case. They have a very large endowment and certainly a lot of expertise. Not all of us can invest in solar plants in the California desert, but community solar is a concept that is accessible to almost all of us. One of the first examples was solar shares with SMUD, the Sacramento Municipal Utility District, and I'm actually in Sacramento today. With solar shares, anyone, including renters, can purchase or subscribe to enough PV to achieve Z&E. So let's say you need 4 kW or 3 kW of PV to achieve Z&E. You subscribe to solar shares, and the production from those PV panels that you've leased gets credited to your electric bill just the same as if those panels were located on your roof. So it's an interesting concept. Next. It's a concept that the electric utilities are pushing. Next. And we expect growth to top over 500 megawatts of capacity by 2020, and some are estimating that this is an underestimate, that it could be much more than that. So if you are one of these challenged buildings, community solar is one way to go. Next slide. There's 2 participation models with community solar: a capacity model and a subscription model. With a capacity model, the participant leases on a long-term basis or buys up front a certain number of panels. This has a high probability of adding additional renewable energy to the grid, and also it's likely included in the capital improvement budget. The other participation model is a subscription model, and with this you can basically opt out any time you want. You subscribe to solar shares, for instance, and next year you decide, well, I don't want to pay that extra cent or 2 cents a kilowatt hour, so I'm going to just get regular power, and you can back down. So this has a low probability of adding additional renewable energy to the grid, and also it's more likely to be included in the operating budget. Next slide. The final option I'm going to talk about are RECs, renewable energy certificates, and RECs are an interesting financial instrument. Basically, the value of a megawatt hour of renewable energy generation is divided into two pieces. One piece is the direct electricity sales, which would be purchased by the utility or used by the building, and the other is the environmental benefits. And the environmental benefits can be sold separately from the actual power. RECs there's lots of different kinds of RECs. They can be restricted to solar generation, wind generation, biomass, and also they can be restricted to a particular vintage, a megawatt hour generated within 2017, for instance, or 2016, and they also can be restricted to a particular geographic area. Without restrictions, the cost of a REC is pretty inexpensive, less than $1 a megawatt hour. So to achieve Z&E by buying RECs would be a very low-cost option, but it also would have less likelihood of achieving additional renewable energy onto the grid. Next slide, Ross. Okay, here we go. So what I've done in this diagram is show the priorities for off-site. Next. So the first option would be to buy or install an off-site wholly owned system like Stanford, or to arrange for a community system through a capacity agreement. Both of these options would have a high probability of additionality and they'd be included in the capital improvement budget. Next slide. The second option would be to purchase RECs or to purchase or to subscribe to a community solar system. Since you can opt out at any time, this has a much lower probability of additionality, and also these costs would typically be included in the operating budget, not the capital improvement budget. Next. And then the last option would be to factor in the renewable energy that's already in the grid. Until this reaches 100%, and this probably won't happen for a long time, you'll never get completely to zero this way, because you multiply times 1 minus the percentage of the renewable portfolio standard. And in my state of California, that's now around 25%. It'll be 30 in 3 years, and it's supposed to be 50 by 2030. But it's still not 100%. It would need to be 100% before you could get to zero net. Next slide. So that's it for me. I think we're going to hold questions until the end, so I'll pass the baton back to Ralph, who can introduce the next speaker.
Great, okay. Thanks so much, Charles. I think we definitely will have some questions coming in for you. It was great technical content. So next we're going to be going to Eric Shafran.
Thank you, Ralph. So I'm going to talk a little bit about the National Western Center. You can actually skip 2 slides to the slide 3. And I'd like to introduce everybody to the National Western Center, exactly what it is, and discuss what our current plan or strategies are for achieving zero net energy on our campus, and why we're looking to achieve zero net energy on our campus. Next slide. So a little bit about the National Western Center. The National Western Center is a redevelopment project of an existing campus that houses the National Western Stock Show, which is a conference or an event that happens every January, 3 weeks in January, and has been going on for 110 years, which is essentially a showcase of livestock and equestrian activities, and it is the home for significant commercial activity, transactions related to within the agriculture, specifically the livestock market. And the campus is in the northeast quadrant of the city of Denver and has been there for 110 years. And we are pursuing the redevelopment of that campus and expansion of that campus. It is an event, if you go to the next slide please, an event that attracts close to 700,000 people and has over the last 3 years. It happens every January, and our numbers for January were very consistent with 2015 and 2016. Our hope is in the redeveloped campus that we grow that number significantly to 1 million or more, but it's an event that takes place every year and is fairly significant for the state of Colorado and for the American West. Next slide, please. So our goal with the redevelopment is to follow a bold vision of creating the global destination for agricultural heritage and innovation. Next slide. And what that means is that we hope to work on answering a question that the ag industry has been asking for many years and is still working on finding the answer to, which is how do we feed 9 billion people with the shrinking pool of resources. This is the challenge that the industry grapples with, largely unknown, I would say, to the urban world. This is a challenge that exists within the rural population, but is very real. Resource management is central to modern farming and ranching, and so how do we solve this global challenge of feeding a growing population with a shrinking pool of resources? Next slide, please. The mission that has emerged for the National Western Center is, our goal is to convene the world at the National Western Center to create, educate, entertain, inspire, lead, and deliver global food solutions. So beyond the stock show that happens every year in January, we are looking to the National Western Center to create a campus that is home to year-round activity around the agricultural industries. We're looking currently at 13 different industrial clusters within agriculture that we would like to bring to this campus, and not only educate and entertain through the stock show every year, but inspire, create, lead, and create a nexus of activity around agricultural industries where big questions like how do we feed 9 billion people, or how do we address global food security, those questions will be answered on this campus. Next slide. So who is involved in this project? So 5 partners were convened in 2014, and they came together to envision the future of this campus. You can click again. And they are Denver, the City of Denver, National Western Stock Show, which is a nonprofit, the Denver Museum of Nature and Science, History Colorado, and Colorado State University. And a master plan was developed through collaboration and adopted by City Council in March of 2015. Next slide. And that master plan defined a new campus, growing the existing 130-acre campus to an estimated 240 acres. It's located in a very opportune location within the city of Denver at the junction of I-25 and I-70 with commuter rail access to the airport. It becomes a new northern gateway for the city of Denver for folks that are coming from the airport and traveling along I-70 towards downtown. Our goal is to honor the past, the 110-year history of this campus while envisioning a campus that addresses the challenges that I described within agriculture for the future. And we'd like to create a year-round destination that brings commerce, experiential learning, research, entertainment, and the arts all to one place. And it serves as a bridge, a critical bridge between the rural and urban food interests, the future really of food within this country. Next slide. So the campus, the development of the campus is outlined within the master plan as 8 phases of development over the next 20 years. The orange and red circles indicate what we will be pursuing in Phase 1 and Phase 2, and that is currently what we are funded to do. So we received funding through multiple sources in October, or really through the balance of 2015, that fund the first 2 phases of development, which, as you can see there, is a significant portion of the campus, and replaces most of the existing facilities that National Western Stock Show utilizes in January with brand new facilities that meet the growing needs for the stock show every year, as well as providing for these future uses and the bringing Colorado State University into the campus with 3 facilities as well that help address that critical mission of the campus. Next slide. So there are 9 guiding principles that are outlined in the master plan, and I will just draw your attention to one of them, which is on the left, embrace an ethic of regeneration. So within our overall goals of inspiring health and wellness and celebrating the Western heritage, we also identified the desire to build a regenerative campus, a campus that that with zero net energy being one of our goals, but that really aspires to be not only a campus that uses less, but a campus that actually regenerates and gives back. Next slide. And the goals related to our regeneration platform are outlined in Appendix D of the master plan, the Sustainability and Regeneration Framework. It has broken down into 9 categories, 63 goals that address all 9 of the guiding principles, and within those goals are net zero for energy, waste, water, and stormwater. Next slide. And focusing just on net zero energy, there are opportunities abound within the campus. Opportunities for solar, geothermal, cogen, sewer heat recovery, potentially wind, waste to energy, waste to fuel. All of these are options that we will be exploring within the context of understanding how these technologies both may be utilized at the campus to address the demand needs for the campus, and also being very sensitive to the neighborhoods within which this campus sits. Next slide. Next slide, please. Yeah, so within this, the campus actually sits nestled among the Globeville, Elyria, and Swansea neighborhoods. So the technologies that we pursue will be technologies that are consistent with the desires and concerns of the surrounding neighborhoods. But when it comes to solar, the opportunity is tremendous. We have within the overall campus at full build-out, north of 1.5 million square feet of potential rooftop for solar within the campus, and not much of that, the equestrian facility that you see at the north, the livestock facility in the center, the water resources center, as well as the maintenance facility, and the TOD on the right, all of those are facilities that will be built in the funded Phase 1 and Phase 2 of this campus build-out. So the opportunities for solar are significant. Next slide. Additionally, we are exploring an opportunity for sewer heat recovery. Along the western boundary of the campus run the Delgany Interceptor sewer pipes, a 72-inch and a 78-inch sewer pipe that transfer 45 million gallons per day of wastewater up to the Metro Wastewater Reclamation District's facility 1.5 miles to the north of our campus. And Metro, the operator of the pipes, has a 4-degree centigrade temperature problem at their facility. The effluent that they are pumping back into the river is 4 degrees too warm. And so we are exploring, in partnership with Metro, the opportunity to capture the heat that is in those 45 million gallons per day and potentially reuse that heat to heat our campus, not only the buildings, but potentially snow melt for much of the grounds. If you can imagine, the stock show happens for 3 weeks in January every year, and operationally, if we had the stockyards, which are going to be 20 acres of open space open to the outdoors, if we did not have to be shoveling snow during those 3 weeks in January, the operational impact of that would be tremendous for the National Western Stock Show. So this is an opportunity that we see If it is technically feasible, we see some real opportunity with sewer heat recovery. Next slide. So Charles talked about the opportunities within campus, and I think campus scale of this 240-acre build-out provides some real opportunities for achieving zero net energy, enabling us to balance some of the high demand times during the year with just simply the sheer scale of the campus and our ability to provide rooftop solar or sewer heat recovery. Having a university partner with Colorado State University is just a fantastic opportunity for us to explore cutting-edge technologies. The operational efficiency of managing a large campus that will be built from the ground up is a great opportunity for us. We will be pursuing fully integrated design, so these goals were outlined in the master plan, and we are just now launching our next phase of overall planning for the campus. So we're starting early, which is always important, and this marries well with the city's 2020 goals for sustainability. Next. On the challenges side, of course, funding is always a challenge. Funding the first cost for some of these technologies with a budget that has been established through the funding mechanisms that were approved by the voters and by the state of Colorado. We are capped in what we can spend, so funding will be challenging. Tenant controls with a campus that will be essentially rented out for significant portions of the year. Establishing the proper controls for the tenants is critical. Regulatory hurdles always a challenge. And we'll be exploring that shortly, as well as defining a successful process for fully integrated design. Next slide. So who is the team that is undertaking this endeavor? The City of Denver, National Western, Colorado State University are the three primary partners, and CSU brings significant experience with cutting-edge technologies, and they have a number of institutes within the Colorado State University that are going to be working on this. Next. We also have a number of outside partners, the NRDC, Denver Water, our local water utility, the National Renewable Energy Laboratory is a partner, as well as Metro Wastewater Reclamation District. And since I created these slides back in October for the Getting to Zero Forum, we have since brought on CH2M Hill as, or actually CH2M rather, as our program manager, and they bring significant experience in sustainability to our team. Next slide. So what is our process? How are we getting there? So this is the process that we have outlined, and we'll be working with CH to dig into the details and refine this over time. But starting with the master plan, which outlined our regeneration framework, those 63 goals for sustainability. One of our first exercises is to turn that into a regeneration roadmap, to take those 63 goals, many of which are somewhat amorphous or vague, to turn those into an action plan for how we address sustainability, not only net zero, but the other net zero energy, but the other 62 goals as well. Screening analyses are next, energy, waste, water, and stormwater, and I'll talk about exactly what the energy screening analysis is in a moment. And then we look at the technical feasibility based on the results of our screening analysis. How feasible is a solution to achieve zero net energy from a technical, economic, cultural perspective? Looking at our borders, are the borders of our district defined by the campus, or are the borders a little bit more permeable? Do we look beyond our campus to achieve that zero? And then an analysis of procurement. What are our options for procurement? Is it going to be traditional procurement? Do we look at public-private partnerships? What are the opportunities out there? From there, we get a district strategy and conceptual infrastructure plan that outlines our guidelines, our technical performance specifications, and the design standards that we will utilize in the design of all of our systems. And then from there, based on our procurement decisions, we develop whatever bridging documents are necessary and move into procurement. Next slide. So the screening analysis for energy, I won't go through all of the detail in here, but essentially the goal here is to clarify, first of all, what are our goals, what are the metrics that we plan on using to measure our success, and we have to understand very clearly what the demand and load distribution is going to be for the campus. When is our peak demand, and how realistically can we meet that peak demand in a district infrastructure scenario. We will look at the various technologies that can be used, both from the heat perspective as well as electricity perspective. We will have to do cost estimating, life cycle costing, analyze policy issues, and then look again at the financing options based on an understanding of cost. And from there we get to a preliminary energy strategy. Next slide. And one thing that Charles mentioned is in his analysis of the ability of utilizing solar to achieve net zero at a building scale, of course, achieving maximum technical potential in the buildings is critical before even considering renewables. So this slide has been, I think folks have probably seen this in many different iterations, but the process through which we will be pursuing net zero really starts first with minimizing the building loads, maximizing the system efficiency, optimizing operational and occupant behavior before we even consider renewable energy. Being obviously the more we spend on the design and minimizing those building loads, the more time we spend optimizing behaviors and coming up with strategies for controlling tenants, the less money we will have to spend at the end of the day on renewable energy as to bridge the gap to net zero. Next slide. So where are we in the process? So we are knee-deep in land acquisition and rail consolidation and expanding the campus. We have a lot of land we have to buy, and we have to move a railroad, which will take a fair amount of time. We have ongoing environmental work, but the preliminary planning studies is really what we're knee-deep on. If you can click to next. We're knee-deep on the preliminary and planning studies. One more click. And within those preliminary planning studies, it's really taking our master plan to the next level. Our campus placemaking study is going to be launching very soon, and we call that our master plan version 2.0. Hopefully we'll marry that with a concurrent regeneration feasibility study. We have an ongoing analysis of parking and mobility on the campus, exactly how do we address the mobility needs on the campus, making sure that we can keep the patrons separate from the operations from a safety perspective, and then also ongoing economic feasibility study and kind of a search for co-development opportunities within the campus. What additional square footage can we bring to the campus to support the mission of the overall campus? Next. So the regeneration feasibility studies which follow the screening analyses must work very much in concert with the other primary studies that we're doing. If you can click next. The campus placemaking study is in working concurrently with the regeneration feasibility study. In campus placemaking, we will be refining our program. So as we refine that program, we must feed the details of the refined program into the net zero study to inform the demand modeling that we're doing in that regeneration feasibility study, and then feed the district infrastructure recommendations back into the public realm study. So if, for example, we are going to have a central plant, which seems pretty likely if we pursue district strategies, district infrastructure strategies, we need to find a location and ensure that that location works well with the overall program for the campus. Next. Similarly, there must be collaboration between the regeneration feasibility study team and our parking and mobility study team, sharing greenhouse gas and carbon footprint data, feeding parking requirements that are developed in the parking mobility study into the regeneration feasibility study, so we can understand is there potentially additional square footage for solar, for example, if we're going to be adding more parking, or are we reducing parking from the master plan. So all of that needs to be considered in pursuing our regeneration strategy. And that is it. Thank you very much.
Great, thanks so much, Eric. Ken, we can move. So I'm going to open up some questions here, and then you can discuss these questions with the gang. So let me just get started here. I think one of the first questions that came up with the Stanford campus strategy, Charles, when they developed that desert system, did they account for line losses and transmission losses, the kind of thing we think about with source energy in sizing the capacity of that system?
Well, the system is not sized to achieve Z&E on the campus level, but it is going to offset all of the central plant on campus and about, I think, a third of the other buildings. But I believe they did. I believe they did account for all of that, or well, not directly. I think they're just looking at kilowatt hours pumped into the grid in the desert and kilowatt hours taken out of the grid in Palo Alto. So probably distribution losses and so forth are not directly factored into their calculations, but I'm not absolutely positive about that.
Okay. There's a question, Ken, use an acronym which we tend to do in our industry, ESPC, Energy Savings Performance Contract. Can you explain a little bit about ESPCs and the GSA and how you're using that in this kind of campus model?
Yeah, we're not. We're often using it at the building level, but basically, yeah, we did this whole series of workshops with the Rocky Mountain Institute on how to use our ESPCs to really go for greater energy savings, coordinating with Department of Energy and the energy savings company. So basically, we contract with them through the Department of Energy to, they guarantee the energy savings, and so we basically don't pay other than, they get their payment out of the energy savings. So the incentive is for them to get those savings, and so we just really have been pushing them to go for much greater energy savings than the typical ESPCs get.
Great. Okay. So there's this question about RECs. Charles, I think you had talked about renewable energy certificate, and are you selling an offset in the cap and trade system is the question. So this sounds pretty specific to California, but maybe you can address a little bit more on renewable energy credits and how they work within the system.
Well, that's an interesting question. There's an organization actually in San Francisco called Green E that certifies RECs, and they're intended to include the environmental benefits of renewable energy. But what's happening is that there's also a market for carbon offsets, as the questionnaire brought up, and in a case like that, the REC would not include the carbon offset. It would just include the other environmental benefits.
Mm-hmm.
So it's the REC market is, in my opinion, a little confusing, and it's in my list of priorities, offsite priorities. It was the last one that I listed because it has a low probability of bringing new renewable energy onto the grid, and it's also something that's a part of the operating budget, not the capital improvement budget. And it's something that can be, you can cease buying RECs whenever you want. RECs are, a REC represents the environmental benefits of 1 megawatt hour. So to achieve ZME, you would need to buy enough RECs each year for the whole life of the building, and there's no guarantee that building owners will continue to do that.
Yeah. I know that the DOE definition has a separate, ZNE REC or zero energy REC definition, but it's also seen as potentially really a lesser qualification. And at NBI we consider purchasing renewable energy credits as not a method to get to zero, although some people will certainly do that. But it's not what we use in our verification. So a question about the National Western Center. Are you considering energy storage, this kind of, an emerging approach to zero net energy, and energy storage being, I guess, electric or thermal, as part of the overall infrastructure strategy, Eric?
I think that given what we think, and we have not done the analysis yet, but logic states that we will have significant peak demand. If we have, on the campus, we have 5 venues of large scale between 1,000 seats and 10,000 seats. And it is very likely that we will have several of those running at the same time, probably in the evening when the solar cells are at their most useless. So I think it is likely that we will want to study the opportunities for storage, whether it's thermal storage or electricity storage on the campus, and that's something that we'll be exploring in our feasibility study and screening analysis.
Great. So I think there's an obvious answer to this question, but and either any one of you can answer this, but do you see this kind of scaling at a campus or district scale as an important component of us getting zero net energy buildings to scale?
Well, this is Charles. In my opinion, the answer is yes. I think taking school districts, it gives them many more options for getting there. There are some issues that have got to be worked out, though, with net metering policies and the way that electricity is purchased by the grid in order to make this work correctly.
So you're talking about the utility rate structure, the tariffs, and how school districts might be able to produce more on one site and get credit for it on another site?
Right. You know, the way most net metering policies work right now is you look at each individual meter, not a collection of meters. Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. And when the exported energy through that meter exceeds the energy that's used on an annual basis, the compensation for that exported energy is usually at a much lower rate. Mm-hmm. But if you were to group, you know, a dozen meters, like in the case of the Dry Creek School District, and apply that criteria to those dozens of meters, it would be a much more favorable situation to the school district than if the criteria is applied individually to each school.
Yeah. Great. Ken, you were going to...
Yeah, I was just going to say, certainly on the federal level, as I mentioned, most federal buildings are on campuses, and particularly for GSA, we have a lot of high-rises where, you know, in urban centers where it's just very difficult to get to net zero. So definitely the campus approach is preferable where possible.
Yeah, and I think the campus approach provides potentially for the most cost-effective method to achieve net zero on a large scale. I mean, if we look at the overall goal of net zero, which is essentially reduction in reliance on fossil fuels and reduce stress on the grid, among others, by enabling buildings that potentially are easier to achieve net zero with, like warehouses or schools, to partner with buildings that are less capable of achieving net zero, like office buildings or high-rise residential. It just provides for greater opportunity and flexibility to achieve the efficiency that really is the ultimate goal.
Excellent. Well, we've come to the end of the time for this webinar, and I want to thank Ken and Charles and Eric. You were an excellent panel, and I want to make sure that everyone does take the opportunity to complete the survey that you're going to be asked to complete at the end of this webinar. And also, please do join us for our next and final webinar in this series, The Risks and Rewards in the Z&E Marketplace. And that's coming up on March 30th from 10 to 11 a.m. Pacific time. So thank you all, and we'll see you for our next webinar.
Thank you, Rob.